To this little run through of double materiality. So this is a new concept that you probably heard quite a bit about already, and you're probably curious to know a little bit about what it is and how it works. So that is what we're going to talk about now. My name is Mia Holmsen, and I'm an associate manager with CEMAsys, and I've been in charge of this double materiality product package. So in terms of what we're actually going to go through today, we're going to do through a tiny bit of a presentation. We're going to go through the ESRS, impact materiality, financial materiality, and eventually double materiality. And then we'll talk a little bit about the workbook that we are offering as a part of our services. So introduction. So I wanted to just give some initial notes before we get into the rest of the material. So an important thing to note with double materiality in the context of CSRD, EU's new reporting directive, is that a paper trail is more important than ever. It is really important that you document the entire process while you're doing the double materiality assessment, because this needs to be verified by an auditor at some point down the line. So it's very important that we, for example, use reputable sources when we're doing this, so the information that we're providing is actually verifiable. And yes, in terms of a previous work and other frameworks that can be used, I've listed GRI, TCFD, TNFD, SBTI, and CDP, Climate, Water, and Forest. So as you probably know, these are existing standards and frameworks. The good news with ESRS, CSRD, double materiality, is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel in many cases. So you can take a lot of the information that you have provided with these frameworks and supplement it with your CSRD reporting, also when it comes to double materiality. And when you do a double materiality analysis and you do it the right way, you can have one stone, multiple birds, as I call it. So we do one analysis that can feed into a bunch of different frameworks. So for example, yes, we do a double materiality analysis, but that can also feed into a GRI process, for example. We'll go through more of that later. All right. So what does materiality actually mean? So materiality means the most important things for the organization to report on, because in theory, you could report everything from here to the moon, but the reporting would probably not be that good and you would never reach your deadlines. So that's why we do a materiality analysis to figure out what is the most important things. And when it comes to double materiality, this is essentially what it means. So matters that are material from an impact standpoint, financial standpoint, or both. So that's when we come up with, you see this graph over here. We have one axis that is impact materiality, or how significant are the impacts that you as an organization has on the outside world. If you're familiar with the GRI framework, this probably sounds familiar as well. And then we have the financial materiality axis. So how much can outside aspects actually affect your company financially, either short, medium, or long term? So you probably see that it is a bit, it's a bit of a circle. That means that even if something is not financially material, but it's very impact material, it shall still be reported on. So that when it comes back to material from either impact or financial or both. So ESRS, you have probably heard about this in the context of double materiality, because ESRS are all the disclosures or the documents where all these disclosures are. So we really need to use ESRS actively when we do our double materiality analysis. And this is why. So when we look at the structure of ESRS, we have ESRS 1, which is general requirements. You don't have to report anything here, but it's a very handy kind of like guidebook in terms of what else needs to be reported. We have ESRS 2, general disclosures. So this is general information that needs to be reported by all companies, and these also go hand in hand with all these topical standards, which we see under here. So we got everything from ESRS E1 to E5. These are the environmental part of the topical disclosures. We have S1 to S4. These are social. And then we have G1, which is business conduct, which goes under government, or you probably recognize ESG. Yes, just gonna get this away. Yes. So all of these topical standards are subject to the materiality assessment. So it is a very good idea to actively use ESRS when we're trying to determine what is the most important things for our organization to actually report on. And as we can see here, we got some policies, action, targets, and metrics, and that is what CSRD is pretty much all about in regards to the topical standards. So during the especially during the double materiality assessment, we're trying to figure out what policies, action, targets, and metrics should we actually report on to inform our stakeholders about how our company is doing when it comes to these matters. So DR, that stands for disclosure requirement, and AR stands for application requirements. So disclosure requirements and application requirements and topical ESRS that are applicable in conjunction with ESRS 2 general disclosures. This is just an overview here, because remember that I said that some of the general disclosures that all companies need to report on goes hand in hand with the topical disclosures. So you can find this in ESRS 1 with the overview, so you can see that they go a bit hand in hand. For example, in this requirement from ESRS 2, we need to report on material impacts, risks, and opportunities, and their interactions with strategy and business model. This essentially means that you need to have a good overview of how your processes look when it comes to identifying impacts, risks, and opportunities, which is essentially what we are doing in a double materiality analysis. So when it comes to sustainability matters, so you will see a long list of what we call topics, subtopics, and sub-subtopics in CSRD. These collectively refer to sustainability matters. For example, so a sustainability matter can be own workforce. It can also be working conditions, which is a subtopic of own workforce. And if you want to go even more granular, it could be health and safety as a sub-subtopic. So just know that when people are referring to sustainability matters, it can be referring to all of these three levels. And important to note that even if, yes, ESRS is a wonderful framework to start with and have as a foundation in terms of figuring out what to report or not, you should also do a further assessment to see if there is any company-specific information that you should also be disclosing on. So as you can see here in the little beige peach color, we got some company-specific. Yes, there will be a company-specific sustainability matter. That could, for example, be mental health, because if you, in your analysis, figure out that we actually have a very big impact on our employees' mental health, for example, you can still include it in your reporting. Here is the list that I talked about with all the sustainers on topic level, subtopic level, and sub-subtopic level. So I'm not going to go through the entire list, but as you can see, it is quite extensive, and it is best practice in a double materiality analysis to actually go through each and every single one of these to ensure that you have covered what you should cover, essentially. So, oh yeah, now I also want to mention this little text that's on the bottom. That is, using this list is not a substitute of the process. Using this list is not a substitute for the process of determining material matters. This list is a tool to support the undertaking's materiality assessment, aka you still need to do your own analysis as well, even if this is a very good starting point. Okay, so what does the overall process actually look like when we talk double materiality? First, we need to start with value chain screening. What does this mean? This means to paint a picture of your organization. So when we do value chain screening, we do exactly that. We look at your company and we look at all your value chains and try to establish what does it actually look like. This could either be fairly easy or it can be very complex. But because this needs to be a verifiable process, it is really important that we actually get a good overview of exactly how does your organization and the ecosystem around it actually look. So what we'll typically do here is have a chat with people internally at the company that actually know a lot about how value chains operate and such. And we can also talk to some key stakeholders and also some experts in order to kind of get the full picture. So what we also do here is that we try to find some dependencies. We will get more into dependencies here, but in the value chain screening, we figure out what is the organization dependent on to function as an organization. But we'll put a pin in that and come back to it later. Then, after we have done the value chain screening, we will do our impact materiality analysis, which means that we are identifying what impacts do we have as a company on outside matters. Then, after impact materiality, we can establish financial materiality. So then, do the other side of the coin. We will eventually consolidate this into double materiality. And then we connect the ESRS disclosures. You remember those from here? Yes. So then we connect the disclosures and then we can report it. And then I just wanted to, as you can see in the little thing under, use topical standards throughout the process for inspiration and guidance. Again, because this massive list that we are provided with is supposed to be a tool that we use. So we use it throughout the process, and then we also need to see if there are anything more company specific that also needs to be reported on. All right, when it comes to frequency of the double materiality analysis. So I would highly recommend to put in a lot of hours the first year you are doing this. Because if you do a very thorough materiality analysis year one, odds are you don't have to do that much, you don't have to do any more of the groundwork after that. Because the recommendation from CSRD is that, well, if you do it really well next year, then you can spend your energy and time on the most important things, actually, gathering the information and reporting and putting your strategies into practice in the years to come. So I would really recommend doing it not halfway the first time around. Do it properly, because that will really help you build the foundation that you continue to build off of. All right, so now we're going to get into all the steps of the materiality analysis. So as I did talk a little bit about, first we have the value chain mapping. So this is what it looks like in a bit of a spider map type situation. So we know we start with a value chain mapping, and that's what we're going to talk about now. And then from here, we need to identify some activities and business relationships and dependencies. That is essentially what we are doing here. So things that are important to take into consideration when we do a value chain mapping. So it's important to do this as broad as you possibly can at first. So you go really broad and figure out what does everything look like. So we need to look at all the geographies, both of our own operations and also those of our suppliers and our served markets. We need to look at the size and significance of, for example, our business relationships. Let's say our suppliers. If you spend a lot of money on one supplier, odds are they're probably more of a relationship there in terms of both impacts, risks, and opportunities. This can be done either in monetary value, duration of supplier relationship, or importance of supplier relationship. And then some examples of what a business relationship could be: suppliers, customer, joint ventures, etc. Essentially just anything that you are collaborating with or buying stuff from or selling stuff to. Those could be business relationship within your organization. And then we also need to establish some activities, which essentially just means what are the things that you do in the organization. Maybe you do production, transportation, coloring, all of these things. We need to establish the activities that actually goes on. And then we also need to establish the dependencies. Again, what is the organization dependent on for their business to run? And the reason for this is that we need dependencies, activities, and business relationships from the value chain screening to be able to continue our process. So it's very important that we methodically work with this. So we do first the value chain screening, identify dependencies, activities, and business relationships, and then we can move on to other things. Oh yeah. Also want to mention some tools. So tools that you can use in the value chain mapping, typically stakeholder interviews. So here I would highly recommend not run around, speak to 200 different stakeholders. It is better to do a quality over quantity approach. Speak to the ones that actually know what they're talking about or have a very good overview of what is happening in your business. You can also talk to some experts. This could, for example, be NGOs or someone that works very specifically with your sector. It can also be, we could look at financial statements in order to kind of look at how much monetary value are in the different parts of the organization, because that can actually help us figure out what is the most material. As well as purchase records, supplier survey responses. I would highly recommend starting with supplier surveys because it is a very good way of actually gathering information from all around your value chain. And we can also use research papers and other trusted sources and indexes such as water risk filter or climate risk filter can be a good idea to use, at least in the initial phase, just to get an overview of where could the biggest risks be in our value chain. Yes, so now we will talk a little bit about impact materiality. So this essentially means that we have come to, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but there is an arrow at the impact materiality bit here. So we have now done the value chain mapping. We have identified some activities and business relationships. And these are the ones that we need to focus on now, because based on the activities and business relationships, we're going to figure out what impacts as an organization do we have, can we have, either in a positive manner or in a negative manner. So all this needs to be consolidated, and then we will find our impact materiality, which will go on one of the axes in the double materiality analysis. Also, if you have worked with GRI, this probably looks very familiar. That's why two birds, one stone. You can very easily also do a GRI process in conjunction with the double materiality process. So just worth noting. So, yep. So based on the findings in the value chain screening, you identify actual impacts, potential impacts, positive impacts, and negative impacts. So again, here we need to work methodically. So use all the topical standards, go one by one, and actually do the work for each one of them. And then after you've completed that, you can do any company-specific things that you have come across that is not covered by ESRS. So in terms of how impacts work, we have the drivers of the impact, and that's why we need to identify the activities and the business relationship, because these are the drivers for any impact. After we have identified all of these impacts, we need to score them. Then we use scale, scope, and likelihood. We'll go a little bit more into that. And eventually we will end up with an impact list, and these needs to be scored. A little bit on scale and scope. Again, if you're familiar with GRI, you probably know what this is about. Scale essentially means how much does something matter right there. And scope is how much does it matter out here. So in order to find out how severe or important something is, we need to take both of these things into consideration. How important is it here, and how important is it here? Or grave or widespread, technical term. All right, so yes, so how we actually score this. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties because we don't have to, but essentially how we score this is that we do scale plus goal, scale plus scope plus likelihood when it is a potential negative impact. So essentially, how heavy is the impact, how widespread is the impact, and how likely is it that it will occur. If it is an actual impact, we don't have to take the likelihood into consideration because, well, it's 100%. Therefore, we just do scale plus scope. We do also have irredeemable character on the left here, as you see it is gray, that is because we have not taken that into consideration in the scoring. And that is because it is hard to say what should you focus the most on, things that are the most redeemable or the most irredeemable. Therefore, it's important that we establish it in the process and that we actually have it, and can refer back to it when our auditor comes to ask. But we can't really put a numerical score on it and it wouldn't make sense. So we've put it in here, but it doesn't have a score. Also, worth noting in the bottom right corner, I see that I've written that when negative potential impacts related to human rights, when potential negative impacts are related to human rights, severity will outweigh likelihood. AKA, if there is possibility that your company has a negative impact on human rights, this needs to have a little bit extra scoring. So even if the likelihood is low that there are human rights violations at like your tier 1 supplier, if the likelihood is low but the severity is high, well, no. If the likelihood is low, the severity should always outweigh the likelihood, if that makes sense. I think so. All right. So when it comes to impacts that are positive, these have to be scored separately from the negative ones, because a positive impact and a negative impact are, although they use the same words, it's hard to measure them exactly up against each other. So we score these separately. It looks very similar. A potential positive impact will be scored by the scale, the scope, and the likelihood of said positive impact occurring. And if it is an actual impact, you guessed it, likelihood equals 100%. We don't need to include it, just the scale and scope. Yes, this is what I said earlier. Negative and positive impacts are scored separately to avoid the prioritization of negative impacts. So if your organization has a lot of wonderful impacts, that is very good, but we can't not look at the negative ones. So yes, of course, we're going to focus on the positive ones, but we also separately needs to see what are the most important negative ones, so we get the full picture and we have a balanced reporting. I don't know if the text actually comes across very well on this photo, but this is essentially something that you need to take into consideration when you're looking at impact risks. Impacts specifically this time around. So when you are working with all these topical standards, so we got your climate change, pollution, biodiversity, etc., we need to remember that many of these are interconnected. So if, for example, look at climate change and resource use and circular economy. Here we have greenhouse gas emissions, energy resources, and non-renewable versus renewable resources. So there's a lot of stuff that goes hand in hand. So just make sure that you also take that into consideration, that it is quite dynamic and it goes hand in hand many a times. Yes. All right, so now we're going to get into financial materiality. So we have now done this entire thing, right? We have done the value chain mapping, established some activities and business relationships and dependencies. From the activities and business relationships, we have established impacts. And from the impacts, we have established our impact materiality. The reason why we do impact materiality first is because risks and opportunities can stem from an impact. So let's say, for example, that you have a potential negative impact on workers' rights in your production country. And then the workers retaliate. That could be a risk. For example, so that could be a impact that translates into a risk over time. That's why we do the impact materiality first. So here we got the dependencies, the impacts. We need to find risks and opportunities. All right, so what are dependencies? So dependencies on natural, human, and social resources can be sources for financial risks and opportunities. Dependencies may trigger effects in two possible ways. They may influence the undertaking's ability to continue to use or obtain the resources needed in its business processes, as well as the quality and pricing of those resources. And they may affect the undertaking's ability to rely on relationships needed on its business processes on acceptable terms. Essentially, what it means, that essentially what it means is that we'll split it into three categories to make it simpler. First, we have natural resources. What natural resource dependencies, that is anything physical, physical that you actually depend on. So split this into renewable and non-renewable resources. It could, of course, be more than these, but renewable resources would typically be fresh water, seawater, rainwater, forests, crops, biomass, all of these things that your organization is actually reliant on being able to produce or source, for example. Those would be a typical renewable resource dependency. And then, of course, we have the non-renewable sources, typically fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, natural gas, metals, minerals, etc. These are just some examples. There could be more. And then we got human resource dependencies. So individuals engaged in various roles and functions within the company or surrounding community. So this would typically mean access to employees and or other workers. And this could also mean skills and talents, recruitment and selection, human rights regulation and legislation, and workers' rights regulation and legislation, because these could be things that you are dependent on for your company actually to run. Last but not least, we got the most confusing one, which is social resources, which can be interpreted to mean most other things that you could be dependent on, and mainly in terms of relations and regulations and legislation. So just added some examples here, all the way from employee relationships, all the way down to international relations, things that you are dependent on from a social resource perspective. And I also decided, I didn't decide to include, it should be included, is regulations and legislation. This could go all the way from the local level all to the international level. So as you can see, it is quite broad, these dependencies that you should figure out in your value chain screening that will feed into the financial materiality. All right, so a sustainability matter is material from a financial perspective if it triggers or could reasonably be expected to trigger material financial effects on the undertaking's financial position, financial performance, cash flow, access to finance, and or cost of capitals. So if you have a risk or an opportunity that could affect any of these things, that would be financially material. Sounds about right. All right, so I'm not going to read out these definitions, but essentially a risk is something that contributes negatively to any of these financial categories. An opportunity would be the opposite, the opportunity to actually make more money off of it. So, and the risk and opportunity, as we have talked about, can stem from an impact or a dependency. So here we got the drivers being impact and dependencies, and that could lead to risks and opportunities. So an impact as a driver example would be, for example, that you have a factory in Brazil and there are greenhouse gas emissions leading to increased global warming potential, actually. So the risks that can be translated into a risk of non-compliance with future legislation resulting in fines and or legal repercussions, risk of non-compliance with future legislation resulting in reputational damage, so on, so forth. So you can have one driver with many outcomes, essentially the key here. But then we can also look at a similar one, but here we got a dependency as a driver, because here we know that because you use fossil fuels in this factory, you're probably dependent on that fossil fuel to actually keep on running. And then we can also see that you can have some risks and opportunities connected to that. So that could, I think this is pretty much the same, but here, risk of resource depletion leading to value chain disruption, leading to loss of revenue could be a good example. Because you are dependent on something in your value chain, there is a risk of, if that is disrupted in the value chain, that could be a financial risk. I hope that made sense. So So it is to some degree up to the company how they would like to define financial impact and time horizon. CSRD is mildly unclear about this, so I would recommend going with a 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and 10 plus in terms of time horizon. But how they define the financial impact can be either quantitative or qualitative, essentially. So it is fairly free how you actually determine how something is financially material, because it will be very specific to your business. So when we do the scoring of financial materiality, we do financial impact plus likelihood. So an example, we can see down in the right-hand corner here of the financial impact. We could, for example, say that if it's low impact, it would be less than 5% of the company's annual revenue. Medium impact would be 5%, and high impact would be 5 or more percent. So these are examples. This one can be tailored to what your company thinks makes the most sense, because this will vary. All right, so in terms of how we got here, so if we see all the way on the left, we can see our old drivers, which we used to establish our impact materiality. So you got activities and business relationships has then become, we have found impacts based on that. In your value chain screening, we've also found dependencies. We have from there go and find risks and opportunities connected to this. These will be scored also separately, because a risk and opportunity needs to be, you need to have a list of both essentially to be able to refer to. And then you will end up with a risk list and an opportunities list, and these will then be scored on financial impact and likelihood. Good. So then we get into double materiality. So now we have an impact list, we have a risk list, and we have an opportunity list. And this will feed into this wonderful little matrix that you see on the right-hand side. So we'll have the impact list that will be on the bottom axis. So then it will both be negative and positive. So we have scored them separately, but for the sake of reporting, we will consolidate it into this matrix. And then financial materiality will then be scored on the y-axis, and that will be a combination of the risks and opportunities. And then it's up to the company itself where they want to set their reporting threshold. So that you'll have to discuss internally post-analysis to see where should we actually set this threshold for reporting. All right, so so this is an example of what this could actually look like. So now I've just put some sustainability matters on these dots. So in this instance, we would probably need to report on some business conduct, because we've seen that that is very high on the financial materiality axis, even though it doesn't have the biggest impact. And we also need to report on workers in value chain, even if it has a low financial materiality, but high impact materiality, still need to report on it. And then we have all the other beige peach ones that has also ended up outside the axis that we will end up reporting on. So I'm not going to get too much into this, but this is very handy to think about when you're trying to determine, but when should we start preparing for CSRD? As we talked a little bit about in the beginning, it is all about policies, action, targets, and metrics, right? So when it comes to policies, actions, and targets, it is fairly simple in terms of if you don't have a policy on something, you don't have to report on it. And it can be, if you found that material, you can create a policy. It doesn't necessarily take the most resources in the world, but it can be a bit more of a work in progress. When it comes to metrics, if you have figured out that a topic is material and you should report on it, let's say, for example, biodiversity and ecosystems, and there are some metrics or data points that you should report on and you don't have the data, technically you will be non-compliant with CSRD. And that is not ideal. So would really recommend, even if you're one of the companies that don't really get hit by the legislation until like 2-3 years, we'd really recommend starting preparing for it now, so that you can assure that you will actually be in compliance with your metrics by the time that you actually need to be. So just in terms of how we normally do the process with the client, not going to go over this in great detail, but normally looks something like this. We go through, again, now you know the entire process, so we're just going to do technical ones. So first, we're going to do the value chain mapping. We usually like to kick this off with a workshop with the client to kind of talk a little bit about expectations. We do expect customers to be a little bit involved in this process, because it doesn't make sense if we as externals do this entirely separately. We do like to have that interaction with our clients to ensure that this actually is the most representative analysis of their company. So yeah, that's how we start our value chain mapping, and we kind of work this out based on more objective research, some stakeholder interviews, some expert interviews, all that jazz. Then we go into the impact materiality analysis. You know everything you need to know about that for now, so I'm not going to go very deep into it. But as we remember, we need to do the impact first, then we jump into the financial materiality. Here we will kick off with a workshop. So here we will present, for example, what we have found in the value chain screening and the impact materiality analysis, and then we will do a workshop with people internally in the company to try and kind of start out the financial assessment and establish, okay, what is actually a low, medium, and high financial risk for you guys, and all of that. And then we will move on to IRO, or impact risks and opportunities consolidation, aka setting up that wonderful double materiality matrix. And then we will have a handoff workshop. So even if ideally you have been fairly involved in this entire process, we just want to make sure when we hand off this project to you that you actually know exactly where to find information, what's the logic behind everything. And we just want everyone to be on the same page, and that you feel very comfortable with this work that has been done. All right, so that was a little bit about double materiality. I hope they at least learned a little something. If you have some more questions about double materiality or CSRD in general, we have a lot of experts on the house that can answer them. So please feel free to reach out either on our social medias or on our website, and we'll see you there.